Thank you so much, John. Thank you for helping this event to happen and for all that's happened during this really very stretching and very stimulating visit in the last couple of weeks. Thanks also to those who've made this venue available and organised the details of the event. As you heard, our family connection with South Africa goes back quite a while, nearly 40 years, and that visit in the 80s was, for both my wife and myself, a life-changing time, which we look back on with immense gratitude. So coming back, as I've been able to do several times in the last few years, has been a great gift and a great grace, and this visit has certainly reinforced that sense of deep affinity and affection for this country and all its peoples. I'm going to be speaking about art and faith in society, but I'm going to begin with two examples which don't have very much to do with either art or faith. And I hope you'll see why in a moment. The first is an experience that I would guess quite a few of us have had of going to the funeral of a friend. And quite often at such an event, you will meet people for whom your friend was a very special person in a way that had absolutely nothing to do with your relationship with them. You might have thought, I'm the most important person in my friend's life, or one of them, and you suddenly discover that somebody else was a very important person in their life too. You look around at the people who gather at a funeral and you think, I never really understood the full range of relationships in which my friend was involved. The other little picture I have is something I've occasionally used when speaking to school children in school assemblies, so forgive my trying it out on you as well. You're watching an interview on television, perhaps two individuals against a dark background, talking intently and apparently quite privately. When you've been part of such an interview, you realise that what's actually going on is that there's a tiny area in a large space with a curtain and chairs, and probably a couple of dozen people crawling around you. There are camera mechanics, sound engineers, people with rather forbidding-looking clipboards on which they've written down all the questions that the interviewer is supposed to ask, and any number of other folk as well. What you finally see on the television screen is a very small part of what's actually been going on. And once again, in a completely different sense, what you see on the screen is a tiny sliver of the relationships that are going on in the space where the interview is being recorded. So I think you may see where I'm beginning to go with those images. What we habitually see of the world we're in is perhaps just a tiny slice of the range of reality of relationships that surround us. And one of the great temptations we have as human beings is to have what I'll call a monolinear picture of the world, one line only. What I see and understand is what is real. It's real because I can grasp it, and usually I can use it. I can make something of it for my own profit. What matters about what's out there is its relation to me now. And what if the world is really not like that? What if there is another dimension to the world we're in? A set of relationships in which the world stands that don't just depend on me? What if what I can see and what I can manage is not the most important thing about the world we share? Am I or am I not willing to let that complexity of relationship unfold? Am I willing to let go of my conviction that what matters is how something relates to me, and let the world blossom and enlarge itself in my perception and my encounter with it? Am I willing to step aside from my central place in everything to let the world disclose itself in new and different ways. And what I want to suggest this evening is the rather obvious point that both art and faith are about that kind of willingness to encounter the world as something more than what I just see and use in instant after instant after instant of successful capture. What if there's more to my relation to the world than that? Because there's more to the world than that. And I think any working artist will agree that one of the most strange and challenging aspects of the activities we call art is that element of letting go, of sensing the relationship of what we see to something more than we actually see. The awareness that what appears to be familiar to us is in fact stranger than we thought. And the job of the artist is in part, not in whole, but in part, to make strange and new what we thought was familiar and what we thought related just to us. The world is a larger place than we thought. And if we shut up long enough and sit still long enough, maybe we'll begin to pick up some of the resonances that are there in front of us, pointing us beyond that immediate setting. Another way of putting that is to understand that what confronts me, whether it's another human face, or whether it's a landscape, or whether it's a set of sounds, all of that has echoes off stage. It's got an interior, a hinterland, we sometimes say, don't we, about people or things. A hinterland, there's something behind there, which is pressing in on what we can see. And 99% of the time, we ignore it. But if we spend enough time, with enough patience and openness and attention, then, as I say, something of that hinterland, that interior, begins to disclose itself. And so, in the activities of art, just as in religious faith, part of what's going on is that we are learning to let that sensed world and reality just beyond what we can immediately grasp, to let that live more fully in our imaginations and the imaginations of those we speak with and live with. There's the task, an enlargement of the world. And I think, and if you wanted to sum up what art and faith have in common, it would surely be something to do with bringing us into a world that turns out to be larger than we thought. Just as when I'm at the funeral and meeting the friends of my friend, I realize my friend was larger than I thought, because involved in more relationships than I immediately grasped. So the activities of art and faith tell us that the world we immediately see and think we've captured and mastered is a stranger, a broader, a richer place. And I find that very often when people involved in the arts talk about their work, they're very receptive to the idea of the sacred in this connection. Not quite the sacred as a religious person might want to put it, but the sacred in the sense of that interior, sometimes hidden, element of reality which emerges when you stop trying to be in charge of everything. Stop trying to be in charge of everything and something discloses itself. Something unfolds. And that's the sacred. And I would say that, that's a bold claim, but I would say that a world which rejects the sacred is a world which keeps getting smaller. And a really secular approach to the world in that sense would be a world reducing itself again and again to the dimensions of what I can cope with and I can get on top of in this moment. Now, part of what's going on in activities that open out the world like that is that I park some of my ordinary habits. I sideline, for example, the way my will works. Here's an argument that artists quite often get into. People sometimes think that art is about basically doing what you like, especially modern art. Oh, there are no rules, are there? You can do what you like now. And most artists get very angry indeed about that. And they say it's nothing to do with will, it's nothing to do with what I like or I fancy. It's not even very much to do with what I choose. Here is something I sense and have to attend to with all the energy I can, even submit myself to. I have to let what's there come through. And that's not about will, it's not about imposing my preference or my perspective on a passive world. It's about learning to respond with generosity and aptitude to what is presenting itself. There again is an overlap between the world of art and the world of faith. It's very seldom that people simply say, oh, I decide to believe. The person of faith is a person not making a sort of wild stab at an accurate theory of the universe. The person of faith is somebody who has, at some level or another, discovered an element, a dimension of reality that calls for their obedience. And by obedience, I don't at all mean jumping to obey orders, but that kind of profound listening, almost a compulsive listening in to what is real, beyond what is immediate. In both art and faith, therefore, there's the crucial dimension of sheer openness to what's there. The mystery of divine presence and divine purpose for a person of religious faith. A mystery which is rather harder to pin down in those terms for the artistic practitioner. But in both contexts, what we're doing is trying to educate and nourish that readiness to listen and to be open to resonances and patterns beyond the surface of things. And in all that, to make something new. To make, literally, a new thing, if you're an artist. To make a new life, a new kind of humanity, if you're a person of religious faith. And that's why, of course, in the activity of the arts, you're never just imitating. On the whole, we don't regard highly a work of art which just says, oh, this is a perfectly accurate representation of how things are. You might very well say, well, I've got eyes to do that job for me. Or, if you want to be a little bit crude, photographs. Though photography, of course, is not just representing what's there as an imitation either. But you see the point. A work of art is not simply reproducing, substituting for what's there. It's a making new of what's there. And sometimes that making new requires making connections that seem very strange and very counterintuitive. Some years ago, I wrote a book in which I reflected a bit, among other things, on some elements of very early human art, prehistoric human art. Notably, that rather haunting figure of a human torso with a lion's head was found in an alpine cave. It's about 20,000 years old. Now, who on earth thought it was a good idea to put a lion's head on a human torso? But the point is, here is somebody who wants to say something about perhaps the crossover between the qualities of certain kinds of animal life and certain kinds of human life. Here is someone who wants to say something about what it might mean to perceive another human being as like a lion. What it might mean, on the other hand, to perceive a lion as a bit like a human being. There's a lot going on. And the philosophical complexity in the mind of that prehistoric artist is, I think, something rather formidable. And likewise, of course, if you look at some of the earliest human art you find on this continent, if you look at the art of the Khoisan people, the cave paintings, the representations of animals and hunt, the creation of an entire symbolic universe, these are not people who have done a fine arts degree or been trained in philosophy. But they are responding to a world which for them is more than just what can be grasped, reduced, and captured. And I think it's very interesting that in the last century and a half, perhaps, the awareness of pre-modern art and its subtlety has become so much more marked. When I was a lad reading articles in the Children's Encyclopedia about the history of art, there was a very simple narrative. Once people were rather bad at art, and now they're quite good at it. I think it's important, actually, to be very simple, to immerse children as much as possible in the world of imagination. There's time enough for them to get the skills later on, but I think the first 6-7 years, let them be surrounded with stories, with sounds, with poetry, with bizarre and startling images. Bombard them with the strangeness of the world, because it's a stage of their mental and imaginative evolution when they will respond and be enriched by that. I say later on they can sort of fill in the gaps and learn the maths. But meanwhile, let them sense something of what an extraordinary reality the world is that they're part of. So, I speak as someone with a 3-year-old grandson, watching my daughter with interest as the child grows, and watching what seems to be a very sensible program of letting the music, the sound, the sight flood around them. And we all know, don't we, that perhaps the deepest deprivation that any child can suffer is not simply the deprivation of love, but the deprivation of imagination. That's what can paralyze and imprison. When a child is brought up with no point of reference outside the immediate and the obvious. And that's a deprivation which can be felt not only by those who are deeply economically deprived, but by people at the other end of the economic spectrum too. So, just a thought, but thanks for raising that. I do think it's a hugely important question. I wish, again, religious people would make more of a fuss about how children are educated. Yes, please.
Your Grace, I was very grateful to read what you said in the New Statesman about King Arthur.
Oh my goodness.
And obviously he's a massive subject, but I was so grateful that somebody had brought him up, because his wisdom or his persona or his being or his something lives on so powerfully, especially in the light of what you've been saying this evening. So
the comment was about something I've written about King Arthur in the New Statesman a while ago. I'm very glad somebody's read it. Thank you. Yes, I think part of what I was saying was that it's very interesting how societies or cultures choose their heroes, their national heroes. And one of the things about the role of King Arthur in the British imagination is, well, I suppose two things really. One is the strange fact that King Arthur belonged to the losing group in the great battle in the early Middle Ages between people like me, the Celtic Aboriginals, and the English, who invaded us and have never apologised, even after rugby matches. How very interesting that the English should adopt somebody from the losing side as a national hero. I think that says something. Second thing, of course, is whatever the great fluidity that surrounds the figure of King Arthur, the deep uncertainty about whether there's any historical basis at all to it, what emerged in the story was an extraordinary drama of both idealism and failure. It's a tragic story, the Arthurian story. It doesn't end well, but at the heart of it is a vision of society, of justice, of generosity, of chivalry, and so on, which I think we're meant to say is worth pondering and worth valuing, even if it's not actually going to work at the end of the day. Because when King Arthur has been defeated and has gone off to the other world to have his wounds healed, when everybody is sort of lying around as a bloodied corpse or seeking refuge in a hermitage, when it's all over and done with, is it still worth trying? Well, I think the message of the Arthurian story is, of course it is. That's the way it goes. So, yeah, I think there's a lot in the Arthurian story that can tell us something. It's not just about having extravagant ideas about chivalry and kind of short-term visions of how things might be better. It's about that deep awareness of a certain kind of value built in to our efforts for justice, a value which is not defeated just by human defeat. There's a bit of theology in there somewhere too.
We seem to be living in a world of millions and millions of displaced people through war or economic circumstance or whatever. Now, the things that we're talking about, can that be used somehow to help people be accommodated and resettled in the new circumstances?
That's a brilliant question, thank you. And actually, it warms my heart because it's something that I've been a bit involved in recent years in the shape of a project which we began at Cambridge, which had to do with migrants and art. It was looking at a number of topics. One was simply what kind of art emerges at grassroots level from people who are refugees or asylum seekers or migrants of one sort or another. Do they themselves use art to reflect on their experience? Well, of course they do. How do we listen to that to get a better understanding of what's going on? How do we give that a place in our own conversation? The other side is by looking at how that works, we ourselves become more attuned to the experience of displacement, more empathetic. And a couple of things there. As I say, we've been working on this project. The book should be out in January or February. We organised a conference in which we took the slightly risky decision of having not just academic papers, but presentations from some people who'd been through the experience of being refugees. We had music, poetry, and visual art from migrant communities, and bundled it all together in Cambridge with a sort of academic reflection on some of these questions. And the energy of that meeting was extraordinary, and it still ripples. So I think, yes, we can use and explore this. Part of the memory there too is of a very powerful experiment conducted by two young English graduates from Oxford who went out as volunteers to work in the big refugee camp in Calais that was called the Jungle, with good reason. And when they came back, they decided they would put together a play about the history and experience of this refugee camp, in which the refugees themselves would have a major role in writing and acting. And this was put on eventually in a major West End theatre in London, which had been, the interior had been reconfigured so that it felt like the refugee camp. There was a grit on the floor. There were very hard wooden benches to sit on. There was an Afghan cafe in the corner with cooking smells drifting out through the theatre. And the actors, as I say, came, not all of them, but some of them came from the camp. And my son, who was at that time doing a degree in drama at an English university, as we came out, said to me, you know, I've spent 3 years writing essays on the social usefulness of drama, and I never realised what it was about until tonight. So there are lots of openings we can use, and I think to understand both how we enlarge our own sympathies in regard to displaced persons and how we give place to and listen to what displaced persons are doing with their own experience in art and imagination, those two belong very fruitfully together. Thank you. Really important question. Yeah.
Thank you, Grace. You spoke about transhumanism and how do we meet that challenge and differentiate humanity?
Ooh. Yes, the prospect of transhumanism, which at its I suppose at its most extreme, almost simplified, is the idea that we could all actually be happily replaced by a program. How we respond to it, I don't know. I think probably it is just by the sheer doggedness of going on working at the sort of frontiers I've talked about, and making sure that some of these issues don't just go by default. Because it seems to me that one of the most important things about our humanity is that we learn as bodies. We're not in midair, we're not just bundles of ideas and clusters of information. We are organic systems. And to learn to be a human being, back to the education question in a way, to learn to be a human being is to learn how to live in your body, as your body, to find your way around, to understand how your body works in relation to things. And all of that is the work of intelligence. And actually that's not what computers do for you. It's not what programs do for you, because the organic is a level of vulnerability for our humanity. Organisms can be hurt, and organisms die. The old chestnut about how you would recognize a very successful simulation, the Turing test, how you'd recognize something as an AI response rather than a genuine human one. That's got a lot to teach us, and I've sometimes tried to boil that down and say, well, we recognize something as a human being if we can talk to it about death, food, and sex, which, you know, on the whole, computers are not very good at. Any of those, as far as I know. So, you know, I think what I'm saying is we need to keep that in the imaginative intellectual public eye. We need to keep up the trust we have in the arts. We need to challenge lazy thinking about artificial intelligence and make sure it's a good servant and not a bad master, and so on. But it's a long job, and quite a lot of vested interest goes into the opposite picture. I don't know exactly what countryman Elon Musk thinks human beings are, but I'm a bit worried by the signs. I'd rather Elon Musk's views did not prevail on the definition of what counts as human.
I think that's a wonderful point that we can end on.
Oh, sorry, John, there's just one more question.
Sorry.
Could I just quickly...
No, of course.
Related to what you just said, artificial intelligence is obviously a very important topic right now, and it's actually been involved in creating art, both pictorial, music, and written words. And I wonder if you could comment on how you feel that has a role to play in the artistic community.
Yes, indeed. AI has a constructive role. It's often now brought into play in various kinds of imaginative construction. And I don't lose sleep over that. I know that from time to time you have an apocalyptic alarmist article in one of the newspapers saying, oh, you know, here are computers writing poems. And I think, yes, fine. Generally not very good poems, but they may get better. But the point is, they're writing poems because somebody's told them how to write poems. And just making sure that, again, the system is a servant, not a master. And that as a servant, it's wonderfully resourceful. There are all kinds of things AI can do, which the unaided individual human mind can't. The time scales are different. But just to give you one instance, not so much from the arts, but it's one that really struck me. A lot of physicians, a lot of clinicians, of course, quite properly and understandably, use online programs for diagnosis increasingly. It saves time. If you've got something a bit untypical, something a bit unusual to diagnose as a physician, you might very well not want to spend 2 days wading through the textbooks and the articles, but type in some symptoms and see what comes out. And I read an article in the New Statesman by a very experienced physician who said he'd been testing this out and he'd had a very unusual case before him where he had indeed typed in the symptoms and come up with what looked like a fairly plausible diagnosis and had not been completely convinced by it. For some reason he couldn't quite explain, and went back to the patient and asked a few extra questions which had to do with the patient's lifestyle, relationships, mental health, and suddenly the whole picture shifted. And he thought, no, that's what the matter is. But had he gone simply with the arm's length diagnosis from a set of granular symptoms, he would have misdiagnosed really rather badly. So that stuck in my mind as an instance of the caution we need, the help it can give, I think, constructive suspicion we should bring to this while acknowledging the achievements.